everybody, it's the Lawn Gnome, and I want to welcome you to the third installment of the 2020 Gnome Docs, the final Gnome Doc, but also part 7 of a fantastic Gnome Doc story that, of course, was requested by all of you, the fans, who loved the first installments of this DC animation history. And I am really looking forward to showing you guys part 7 because I think that this is one of the more interesting times in DC animation history, because it's not just DC animation that was seeing so much happen in such a small amount of time. This was a time where DC and Warner Brothers were seeing a lot of things being done in the world of live-action television, thanks to the CW Arrowverse, as well as starting to plant the seeds of the DCEU. Because around this time, we got the infamous film Batman vs. Superman, Dawn of Justice. But in the world of DC animation, there was also a great deal more happening. We saw DC animation return to Cartoon Network with shows like Justice League Action and DC Superhero Girls. But also, the DC Film Library saw one of its most boldest moments, because we also were starting to see a whole new class come in to the staff of DC Animation because of the fact that Bruce Timm had stepped down and voice director Andrea Romano had stepped down, so it was up to James Tucker and Wes Gleason to really start to take the helm of the DC Animation library and make sure that this legacy continued on. And we got one of the most boldest movies to date in the DC Animation library, because it was the very first rated R DC animated film, and it took Bruce Timm to come back and make sure that this was something that was going to happen, as well as some other famous faces who had been waiting for this specific DC story to be told in animation. But the question really was it going to be good? And what was going to happen to DC animation once they officially had crossed this very interesting threshold in their history? So sit back and relax, everybody, because part 7 is about to begin, and I will see you in the next one.
Two trailer park girls go round the outside, round the outside, round the outside.
2016 arrived, and it would be DC's brightest year in the spotlight, for better or worse. The MCU would reach a new landmark in May of that year, reuniting the Avengers for a follow-up to the record-breaking 2012 hit in Avengers Age of Ultron. DC, on the other hand, was cranking out new media in all areas. In comics, the world of DC would go through another major reboot, as the now called failed project known as the New 52 would come to an end, and DC Rebirth would begin. Rebirth was promoted as bringing the beloved DC characters back to their roots, with great stories, spectacular artwork, and a nostalgic feel rather than the extreme dark tones. Writers such as Tom King, newcomer Joshua Williamson, and the iconic Jeff Johns would seem to show that DC would be getting back on track. DC would even announce the incorporation of Alan Moore's Watchmen universe into the DC Prime world. The biggest DC news would be DC's answer to the MCU, with the release of two highly anticipated blockbuster films. The first was Zack Snyder's Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice, which would see the return of Henry Cavill as Superman, Ben Affleck as Batman, and Gal Gadot making history portraying Wonder Woman on the big screen for the first time. The movie got mixed reviews from professional critics and moviegoers alike. While the film did not do as successfully as hoped for in the box office, blame would be thrown at so many different people. Some blamed the director for making the film too dark and way too long. Some put the blame on studio executives for forcing Snyder to cut 30 minutes of crucial footage out of the film to bump it down to a PG-13 rating so more people would go and see the film. It seemed to not make much of a difference, especially when the full rated R version would be released on Blu-ray, and many who were negative on the theatrical release would change their minds after seeing the complete film. The response to Batman v Superman would make things even worse, as the next film, Suicide Squad, directed by David Ayer, would immediately go into reshoots to aim for the overall fan appeal. What was left was a film that seemed to be all over the place and very incomplete. Though the standout of the film would be Margot Robbie playing the DC animation creation of Harley Quinn almost flawlessly, as well as Will Smith and Viola Davis as Deadshot and Amanda Waller. At the same time, many would be disappointed by Jared Leto's performance as the Joker, and also blame the film for heavily promoting the character and not giving him enough screen time. However, DC was seeing a little more positivity thanks to their work on the small screen. The successful DC live-action show Arrow would be expanded over the next few years with new spin-off shows, creating the CW Arrowverse. The universe would expand in 2014 with The Flash starring Grant Gustin, and Gotham, which would be a prequel story to Bruce Wayne becoming Batman, starring Ben McKenzie as Jim Gordon and Donald Logue as Harvey Bullock. The show would also feature brilliant performances from new faces Robin Lord Taylor as Penguin, Corey Michael Smith as the Riddler, and Carmen Bicondova as Selena Kyle. More shows would continue to premiere, with 2015's Supergirl starring Melissa Benoist, and 2016's Legends of Tomorrow, featuring characters who had already made their appearances in the Arrowverse's first 3 shows. All the shows created a stable fan base, and even on a smaller scale, had annual specials featuring crossover episodes that would be loosely based on DC Comics stories, and featuring legendary names from comics like the Monitor. Another big push was for streaming. By 2016, the streaming capabilities had seen many more houses cut tied with their cable providers and consume all their media via the internet. Even the video store franchises would be driven to almost extinction. Many individual studios started putting blueprints together for their own streaming services, which would eventually turn into what is now known as the infamous streaming wars. For the time, the CW and DC Animation would start production on a series of mini animated shorts based around the Arrowverse. The first would be Vixen, which would feature the cast members Stephen Amell and Grant Gustin. This would also be produced by executive producer of the Arrowverse, Greg Berlanti, and he said that there would be more of these web series to follow in the coming years. Despite the year being a mixed bag, DC would only see one of its busiest years in animation.
Get your cape on, and let's take flight, we can do it.
Back at the DC Animation Studios, the teams were cranking out direct-to-video content for all their appropriate markets no sooner than the ball dropped in Times Square. The children's animation market definitely got its fill. In February, the first of 2 DC superhero Lego films would arrive in Justice League Cosmic Clash. This film would gross over $1 million in both Blu-ray and DVD sales, as Blu-ray was now more affordable. The second film of the year would be the 5th direct-to-home video DC Lego film, Justice League Gotham City Breakout, which would be a more Batman-driven story while featuring his rogues gallery. The film would once again appeal to its audience, but at the end up with the same ballpark in its video sale earnings. It wouldn't stop there, as in August, DC would announce its newest DC animated home video franchise from the ever-popular growing web series DC Superhero Girls. With the ever-hyped 2016 presidential elections only months away, there were many sending messages of empowerment for marginalized groups, and one of the major voices was for the empowerment of women with the major slogan, "The future is female." The world of comic superheroes had seen a massive influx of female writers and artists, showing that the world of comics was not just a man's place anymore. DC Superhero Girls Hero of the Year would feature all the big names in the world of DC Comics like Wonder Woman, Harley Quinn, and Batgirl. The DVD sales were successful, and there were a great many new projects announced that would follow in the coming years. There would also be a final Batman Unlimited film released in Next vs. Mutants. It didn't seem to be a project DC Animation would bet the farm on, as the previous two installments didn't seem to get much of a reaction. The third film didn't even get an official press announcement and got very little promotion. At the very same time, Cartoon Network would make a big announcement saying that the Justice League would make their triumphant return to the lineup in Justice League Action. The show would have many of the iconic names attached, like Alan Burnett and Butch Luchik, as well as Kevin Conroy and Mark Hamill reprising their roles as Batman and the Joker. Many others who lent their voices in DC animation would be attached to the show, but it would be a very different Justice League program. The show was filled with action, but it had more of a nostalgic feel to the Super Friends from the 1970s. The show was filled with a lot more comedy than drama, and it might have been campy, but Justice League Action would find its audience and stay on the air for 2 solid seasons. With all the other DC projects released in 2016, one would think there would be no room for the DC Universe films, but James Tucker would stick to the schedule with another slated 3 films. 2 of them would continue the DC Universe storyline, and one would stand on its own in a very big way. The first film would be the third and final installment in the Son of Batman storyline called Batman Bad Blood, loosely based on the New 52 Batman Incorporated story that will revolve around Damian Wayne taking on his adult clone Heretic that would eventually lead to his death. The story would even take from the pages of Battle of the Cowl from 2009, in which Dick Grayson would put on the Batsuit. Bad Blood would see the Bat family come together to find a missing Batman and would feature the very first appearances of Batwoman and Batwing. The film would hold the same atmosphere as the previous 2 films, but show a sense of unity between the heroes. This film would also give fans the development of Nightwing that they wanted, as well as giving new characters in the story a great deal of screen time for character establishment. The trilogy would end on a high note, grossing over $4 million in home video sales. With the Batman storyline concluded, it would only be the beginning of the Bat family's story. The 25th film in the DC Universe library would see Batman step aside in training Robin in Justice League vs. Teen Titans. With Teen Titans Go still going strong on Cartoon Network, the adult fans were craving a Teen Titans world that has been missing since the conclusion of the 2003 show and the cancellation of Young Justice, in which fans were still begging for a 3rd season. Justice League vs. Teen Titans saw Batman pass on the responsibility of Robin to Nightwing, and Batman believed that Damian needed to learn values of teamwork, but also work with heroes his own age. He would be introduced to Starfire and the Teen Titans, and fans would see a new version of Beast Boy, Raven, and Blue Beetle. The film would also provide a brand new atmosphere that was filled with a great deal of heart, but would still work well in the vein of the DC Universe story. It would also be the very first time that the DC Universe would open DC's Magic World, as the main antagonist would be Raven's father, Trigon. The Teen Titans would even be put to the ultimate test, as they would have to face the demon-possessed Justice League. Most fell in the middle with this new film, and while many were satisfied with seeing the Teen Titans in this universe, people felt the story was not the strongest. However, no sooner than the release of this film would a sequel be announced, and it would be the title that had been in the works since the inception of the DC Universe film library itself. The last film to be released that year would be the most anticipated, Batman the Killing Joke, based on the beloved 1994 graphic novel by Alan Moore. This was a project that had been in the works with DC Animation since 2009. Bruce Timm would even return to produce alongside Alan Burnett. Knowing the true OGs were part of this film, the anticipation would be at an all-time high. Unfortunately, the film would be shelved almost immediately after the poor box office performance of the big screen adaptation of Watchmen. Timm and company were not going to let this opportunity pass them by. Like many of the other successful DC animation projects that came before this film was going to happen. In 2015, after much patience, the announcement of the film was finally made public. It shook the fan base to its core, not only because of the fact that Kevin Conroy and Mark Hamill had returned to reprise their legendary voice roles, but it would also be the first film in the library to be given an R rating. The creators said the film would be a page-for-page, accurate depiction, much like Batman The Dark Knight Returns. However, there was a problem with The Killing Joke, and it was the fact that the source material would not be able to provide a long enough story for a film. The writers decided to work on a prologue story revolving around Batgirl, as her encounter with the Joker was the triggering factor of the story itself. Also, fans were itching for Batgirl to have a bigger role, as she only made a cameo at the end of Batman Bad Blood. The film would be released on the big screen at the 2016 San Diego Comic-Con. When the lights went up, the reactions were not entirely welcome. The Killing Joke received mixed reviews from critics, mostly aimed at the prologue story. It raised a lot of questionable changes to the relationship between Batman and Batgirl, which featured a sexual obsession of Batman from Batgirl, which would result in an unseen rooftop sex scene between the two of them, which displeased a lot of fans. The second half of the film would be given a more positive review, praising the performances of Conroy and Hamill. Clearly, many critics and fans agree that the first half of the film felt unnecessary and disconnected to the second half. Worst of all, none of this opening act had any real bearing on the remainder of the film. Batgirl still came across as a sacrificial lamb in the end. Her insipid romantic drama added no weight to her eventual trauma. Bruce Timm would respond by saying, "We are well aware of the risks that we took, but it was really important to show that both of the characters are far from perfect and will make some pretty big mistakes." Nevertheless, many were still glad that DC Animation was willing to let this leap to an R rating happen. Considering the blunder of Batman v Superman earlier that year, on a more positive note, DC Animation would let it be known that this would not be the final DC animated film with an R rating. The next few years would definitely be an exciting ride. Killing Joke would not see the end of the DC animated universe. As a matter of fact, the DC animated library would get an expansion. The DC Universe and DC Kids libraries would see a third line titled the DC Original Movies. This would be DC animators taking on the DC Universe with a new line of animated movies based on non-linear DC comics and even television shows. The library's first film would definitely be a positive one, as it would be based on the beloved 1966 Batman television show. Batman: The Return of the Caped Crusaders would not only bring fans old and new to a fan-favorite gem that was the 1966 Batman, it would even see the return of the true dynamic duo of Adam West and Burt Ward, lending their voices to those iconic incarnations of the Caped Crusaders. Even Julie Newmar would join the cast to fill the Catwoman catsuit once again. The film was a fun romp filled with many tributes to the original show and much of Batman's lore. Many appreciated seeing West and Ward back, as the film captured the essence of the 1966 show. Still, many felt felt that there was room for improvement as it didn't possess the qualities that many had seen from DC Universe films in the past. Return of the Caped Crusaders still made its mark, grossing $1.1 million in home video sales, and a sequel would be announced soon after. The next film in the library would not be new, rather it would be a compilation of the CWC's animated internet show Vixen. Officially titled Vixen the Movie, the 2 seasons would now be one linear story, much like combining Batman The Dark Knight Returns Part 1 and 2. With Vixen now being the second installment in the brand new animation library, it was time to get to work on another year of animated content. While DC Animation saw its share of positives and negatives in their most productive year at the time, 2017 was poised to work out the kinks in the armor. The year would get off to a strong start on the big screen in February, with the follow-up to the 2013 The Lego Movie. It would not be a sequel, but a spin-off on Lego Batman voiced by Will Arnett. The Lego Batman movie would be all Batman, in the family-friendly comedic romp referencing much of the Batman lore and introducing new incarnations of the characters. This film would also include a voice cast with Michael Cera as Robin, Rosario Dawson as Batgirl, Ray Fiennes as Alfred, and Zach Galifianakis as the Joker. The next DC Universe film would arrive in the same month and excite the fan base with another R rating. Getting only a taste of DC's magic universe in Justice League vs. Teen Titans, the story would get the full brunt in Justice League Dark. The film would also see Matt Ryan return to voice the character of John Constantine after playing him in the short-lived NBC television series Constantine in 2014. The film would also bring characters like Deadman, Zatanna, and Felix Faust to the DC animated film storyline. Though many had already seen them in Bruce Timm's DC animated universe, it would be a great opportunity to see them in an adult-based film, especially with the first appearance of Swamp Thing. The film received positive reviews and was called a fun celebration of the supernatural elements of DC Comics. In April, the Teen Titans would return in the anticipated DC Universe sequel, Teen Titans: The Judas Contract. The title was one that DC Animation faithful were waiting for, as it had been announced for years before. This film would also feature the final performance of Miguel Ferrer, who passed away in January of the same year. In celebration of the title's release, cast members from the original 2003 series would reprise their roles in a prologue featuring Starfire's arrival on Earth and meeting the Teen Titans. The story would show teen heroes continuing to grow, but also maturing as adults, specifically when it came to relationships. The film also starred Christina Ricci as the enigmatic Terra, and even comic book man himself, Kevin Smith, playing himself. A month later, the sequel to DC Superhero Girls would arrive. The intergalactic game saw the heroines take on the Karuga Academy, with Lena Luthor pulling some devious strings in the background. The DC Superhero Girls would then jump into the Legoverse with their first release in 2017, Brain Drain. In August, Bruce Timm would return to write and produce the next DC Universe film. With Harley Quinn's hype at an all-time high, she would be the main focus of Batman and Harley Quinn. This would not only feature the return of Kevin Conroy and Lauren Lester to play Batman and Nightwing, but this film would also see the very first DC Universe library film to go back to the original Batman animated series style. This film would also welcome the talent of Big Bang Theory star Melissa Rauch, providing the voice of Harley Quinn. As much as this film was a true love letter to the original animated series, the film received many negative reviews, mostly for the script and Rauch's performance as Harley Quinn. People did not appreciate the more risque content, as it was never given to us in Batman the Animated Series. Still, in the film's defense, it was more of a guilty pleasure for the faithful fans. While DC Animation may not have seen one of its better years, the big screen was DC's saving grace thanks to Patty Jenkins and the live-action Wonder Woman film, but it would bring the company right back to square one with the underperformance of Justice League. Even with the additions of Jason Momoa, Ezra Miller, and Ray Fisher, the forced departure of Zack Snyder left the film in the hands of Avengers director Joss Whedon. After many changes, the film would end up being a box office disaster, leaving the future of the DCEU uncertain. The year would end on an even sadder note as the world would lose Adam West at the age of 84. His career, however, would end full circle with his final appearance as Batman in the follow-up to the return of the Caped Crusaders in the animated film Batman vs. Two-Face. Art Ward, Julie Newmar, and Meriwether Lewis would lend their voices to the film. But the prize piece was William Shatner as the voice of Two-Face. The film was praised by many as it was based around an infamous lost episode in the original TV series, as the ABC executives at the time felt that Two-Face would be too scary of a character to be put on national television. With a much improved script and homage to the series, many called it a worthy installment of the 1966 canon. The story would be capped off at the end credits with a tribute to Adam West saying, "Rest well, bright night." No one could really tell whether the future was bright or dark for DC Animation, seeing as a whole, their animation division was diving into all kinds of markets and targeting all kinds of demographics. There was still only one place they needed to expand on, and that was capturing their piece of the cyberspace pie. While they already had put their feelers out into the streaming world thanks to the CW Seed and a new animated series for that service already in the works, unsure of how much bigger streaming was going to get, it was time to take the big leap along with that new content.